Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Physical Therapy Private Practice Secrets of the Top 10%. My name is Brian Gallagher. I'm your host. And this week I have a special guest, Laura Figueroa. Right?
Figueroa.
Figueroa.
You got
Laura
it.
Figueroa. I thought I had that down when she told me, guys. I'm sorry. I messed that up. So Laura Figueroa, she's an occupational therapist, and she's doing something that I think is truly innovative and revolutionary. And I thought a lot of you might be interested in hearing how you could be a bit more creative in our practice models going out there in physical and occupational therapy in the real world. And so I hope you're going to be entertained and educated at the same time. For those of you guys who have been, listening for a long time, you know what this is all about. We're trying to give you personal growth ideas, and we're trying to give you tips for professional success. And those of you who are first-time listeners, just chiming in, where have you been? Why haven't you been listening to this podcast all along? My goal is to help as many physical therapists as possible live the life that they've always envisioned for themselves, whatever that may be. It is not my recipe to success. It's yours. And how can I help facilitate that life for you? And secondly, how can I advance the profession of physical therapy, occupational speech therapy? Of course, how can I advance the profession of allied health medicine? Because we have the true secret to success here. It's not about drugs and surgery. It's about health and well-being and taking care of yourself, stress, mental healthiness, as you've heard me say with Dr. Hinson, with quantum medicine as well. So these topics and my guest speakers are here to help us kind of engage you and connect you to materials, data, way of thinking about things that you may not get in traditional school. So we all know school was designed to help us enter the field as a staff therapist. That is all it's going to do. It's not going to help you be good at business or be a good manager or personnel director. It's going to help you to be a good staff clinician. And that's really what it's designed. And then Laura and people like myself, Laura and I, and others, we're here to help you take it to the next level. So let's start off with Laura. Why don't you just share a little bit about yourself, your background, where you went to school, when you graduated. I had to ask you that question earlier, so it was fresh in your mind. And then let's bring up through your timeline, like to where we are today. Like, what is it that you're actually all about and doing? But let's get there second. Let's first talk about you.
Yeah, well, I finished my bachelor's when OT. Remember back in the day when we only needed a bachelor's to be an OT or a PT? I finished my bachelor's in OT and I finished clinicals in 2000. So it's really easy to know how old I am and how long I've been in practice. 2023 now, 23 years. So for the first 15 years of my career, I worked in traditional settings as an employee. I did a little bit of private practice on the side, just seeing clients in their homes. So I guess I could say I've been in private practice for much longer than I've been running my current private practice, but around 15 years in the profession made me almost lose my mind and consider leaving the profession because I was just very burned out. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners can relate to the stress of like really high caseloads, really stressful environments that we work in a lot of times, productivity standards being really high. I was in school-based practice at the time and just traveling to like 10 different schools in a really urban setting. It was just really stressful. And I decided to do the very logical thing of going back to grad school because that's going to be a cure for burnout, right? For me, it actually was. It actually like reignited my love of the profession. And in that process, my thesis that I had to do, I just didn't really want to do it on something related to school-based practice. And I found this idea of like taking work outdoors as a therapist. I read Richard Louve's book. I looked at, I did the Timbernook programming. Angela Hanscom's an OT who has just done an amazing job in like spreading the word about nature and children and how important nature is for children's development. And so through that process, I decided to take all of my private practice outdoors. So I was thinking about leaving the schools and starting to do clinic-based work. I was seeing a few kids in a clinic, probably had about 6 kids I was seeing at the time on the side of my school-based job. And I just decided that I was going to take everything outdoors. And I told all the families that I would no longer be seeing kids in the clinic. I did a few sessions, just kind of practice sessions with my own child and a couple of kids I was seeing for therapy. And loved it. I just never wanted to go back inside. And
That's
so
awesome.
I decided to kind of go all in on that, or all out, as you might say. And
Yeah.
I started Outdoor Kids Occupational Therapy in, what year was it? 2016, I think January of 2016 was when I started it. So it was just me for a year. And then I very quickly hired 3 very part-time therapists. And from there have just kind of grown the business. We've been profitable every year, even during COVID, which is kind of miraculous that the business even survived, because I know it was a really challenging time for so many practices. From this work, like, what happened was people started asking me how to do it, right? They started saying, can I learn about your practice? Could I do a call with you? And so I got into business coaching. And now I also have a second business called Therapy in the Great Outdoors that offers resources, support, free resources and support on a membership site, as well as business coaching and a course on nature-based therapy, all kinds of different things related to supporting therapists who want to do this work. Any kind of therapist, not just OTs. I'm kind of like you, like, I believe that all of us can, this
Yeah,
nature-based thing
definitely.
is beneficial for PT, speech, mental health counselors, OTs too. So so I think that, yeah, that's kind of that kind of gets you mostly up to date with with the things that I've
No, that
been
sounds
up to in the
great.
last few years.
I'm thinking to myself, if I'm sitting at home or I'm on the exercise bike or driving and I'm listening to this podcast, my question is, what did you do with your clinic space? How big was your clinic space? Did you just start doing outdoor
Ah,
therapy in the parking lot? Did you go outside your house? I mean, how did you transition?
yeah. So I didn't own the clinic space. So that is something I didn't mention. I was renting space from a practice owner who did it full
Okay.
time and owned the space, right? And she just wanted to she wanted to rent out some of the space for her to pay her rent, right? So I just paid her per client, I think. I don't even remember really. So I didn't really have any barrier to kind of leaving that space, right? I could just tell her,
Okay.
like, I'm not going to be renting from you anymore. So I had the freedom to do that. Me personally, when I took my work outdoors, I went into like local parks that felt very away from the built environment. So not with a playground, not with like a shelter nearby. I really wanted to be like in the kind of more wild environments. So I used like local regional parks and a huge city park that had like thousands of acres of land. That's not to say that you have to do that when you do nature-based work. Like, you absolutely can do nature-based work by going
Okay.
out onto a school playground. I did that a lot in my school-based job. I just liked, it was in California, and I loved being
Mhm.
outdoors in California. Who doesn't? And so I would
Right.
oftentimes take my work with kids onto the playground. But I do think that, like, in my research for my PhD, the OTs that I interviewed, like, really there is a difference between just taking therapy outdoors and doing what kind of has become the term, I guess, that many people use, is this term nature based, right? And
Yeah.
that nature based term really means like partnering with nature in the process of offering therapy for children. So nature actually kind of becomes like a co-treater in the session, because nature offers these opportunities that we can't kind of create on our own. We just can't anticipate what nature is going to do every session. There's this unpredictability that is there. And nature-based therapists really tend to lean into that and expect and trust that nature's going to bring something to the session that we would not, as human therapists, really be able to offer. So it's a little bit different than taking a toy or something that you might, a game or something you might do with a child outside and just sitting at a picnic table and doing it. That's great. They're getting the passive benefits of fresh air and sunshine and
Sure.
just a different environment, a novel environment. But nature-based therapy is a little different than just taking work outdoors. So
And if I'm listening, I'm pretending like I'm listening. I keep saying that. I won't say that anymore. So let me ask you the question. So does that necessarily mean, like, doing fine motor skills or gross motor skills on uneven surfaces, standing on
Mhm.
branches and twigs as you're going over, maybe a stony path, or sitting on a log and having to weight shift and do things like that
Yes.
while you're balancing on a log, or standing in a creek and the water pushing through your ankles while you're in your waders boots, stuff
Yes.
like that. Is that what you're saying? Like introducing like the elements of nature while trying to um therapeutically apply some treatment skill development, some
Yeah.
development skill in that versus standing on a carpeted floor or a tiled gym or rubber matted this or a fake
Yeah.
set of steps. Is that
Yeah.
what you mean? Okay.
Absolutely. If you think about, so, even, I mean, I think even people who work with adults would understand this, but in a pediatric clinic, traditionally, if you think about what a PT or an OT specifically, maybe not so much speech, but I think when I think of PT and OT with the examples you just gave of like movement, gross motor skills, balance, bilateral coordination, when you think about what we set up for a kid and inside of a indoor clinic, a lot of times we're trying to replicate what naturally exists
Yeah.
outdoors, right?
Yeah.
We're putting these little, kind of dome little things out for them to step
Yeah.
across and try to balance on, or we're having them stand on a Bosu ball and try to balance while they're catching or throwing. And so some of those things just naturally happen outdoors, and the kids don't feel like we're contriving the environment for them, right? They're
Yeah.
more willing, at
Yeah.
least what the therapist I interviewed in my research said, they seem to feel like the kids are more willing to try things that challenge them outdoors because they don't feel like the therapist is the one trying to kind of like manipulate or make them work harder, right? Because nature is just doing this naturally. And we can just kind of partner with nature in that process. So it's not to say that it's always a cakewalk and fun. It's hard sometimes. There's challenges
Yeah.
to nature-based work too. But yeah, absolutely. Those are absolutely the types of experiences that kind of enrich the child's therapy session and their ability to meet goals.
And it doesn't even have to necessarily, as I'm thinking about it, as you're talking, it doesn't even necessarily have to be just a physical contact. It could be the weather, right? It could be a
Yeah.
windy day. It could be a sunny day. It could be a rainy day or a snowy day. And they have to navigate within that. Um, am I correct in saying as a therapist, because I've been a pediatric therapist, I treated children for 10 years
Hmm.
too, and I did children and adults. I always consider myself a swing therapist, children, adults, children, adults. And, how much could I get out of a ball pit and the sling swing and the scooter? And I used every one of those devices, the Bosu, the wobble board. I used everything I could to actually try to mimic the environment. It's funny that you say that.
Yeah.
And then I remember taking my kids out in the parking lot and doing curbs and doing the stony path and stuff like that whenever I could. But it was like a big event to take the kid outside, and everybody was like, "Oh, we're going outside," as
Yeah.
opposed to like the child. When you look at the patient-centered focus of improving one's functional abilities, well, they function in a nature environment, right?
Hmm.
So I was going to ask you, do you find in the therapists that work outdoors, I think I know the answer, that they get greater engagement, greater participation, greater enthusiasm from the patients because they simply want to be there
Yeah.
and they find it and does the therapist find it that they're getting greater advancement in their plan of care because of the multitude of influential elements that are happening all at once?
100%. That is the feeling of all. So I interviewed 22 occupational therapists, like extensive interviews. They were like 60 to 90 minutes long for my research that I did for my PhD. And without question, they all felt as though the outdoor environment really made growth and progress in therapy much more rapid. Now, that being said, we didn't take quantitative data, right? Like we need research on this to show this, but I definitely would say that of the people that I interact with who are in the nature-based space, they absolutely would feel as though for most goals. Now, obviously we don't take off our clinical reasoning hat and just see every kid outdoors, right?
Sure.
There are skills that need to be worked on or are better worked on in an indoor environment. But for the types of things we've kind of been talking about, for sensory processing, for motor skills, for social skills, for play skills, there are so many developmental areas for children, for their mental health, like that are best or optimally worked on in therapeutic ways in the outdoor setting. So
Yeah. Let me
yeah.
interrupt. So are you saying that you tend to lean toward it being more of a group or more of an individual? I mean,
I
again,
didn't talk
clinical
about that.
decision
Yeah.
making. Well, yeah, right.
Yeah. So for my practice, so the approach I developed in the course that I teach is called the Contigo approach. And Contigo stands for Connection and Transformation in the Great Outdoors. So it's an acronym, CONTIGO.
Cool.
So the Contigo approach grew out of what I developed in my early work at Outdoor Kids OT in my practice. And what I was trying to do by developing the approach was to help help us at my practice, right? To help me and my employees all have an idea of like, what are we doing here? Like, let's have a model that we all use that still allows for creativity and us to be our own therapists, but let's kind of all use the same approach so that we have a consistent way that we're serving families in our business. And after developing that made it really easy to start teaching other therapists what we were doing. And the approach developed because I was doing the practical work, but then also looking at all this research as I was doing my master's and my PhD. And I wanted to create an approach that would use best practices. Like what does the education literature, the landscape architecture literature, I mean, there's all kinds of public health literature, all kinds of literature out there about children and nature. So I was taking that literature and also taking the practical experience to create an approach. And in that approach, one of the things that I felt really strongly about was this idea of connection being like foundational to what we do as therapists, all of us as therapists. But what we often see in practice, or what I often saw in practice at the time, this was 10 years ago, but maybe not quite, maybe 9 years ago. I'm dating myself. I'm making myself too old. Was that oftentimes we have a therapist with a child and the parent is like waiting in the waiting room or they're observing the session, but we're not having the parent involved and we're not having other kids involved. And that was like a really key thing for me, is that if we are going to work on social development with children and play skills with children, the best place for them to do that, again, for most kids, there's almost never a always answer in therapy, right? But for most kids, it's really important to have other kids there if you're going to work on social skills, right? So when I started Outdoor Kids OT, our specialty was doing small groups outdoors in nature. So that's kind of how I started. We now do have capacity staff-wise to offer individual services as well. So we do those outdoors as well. But if we're going to use the Contigo approach with fidelity, we would always have a parent or a sibling or a friend or a caregiver, someone in that session with the therapist and the child, so that we're not just kind of treating in a vacuum, right? And then sending the kid back home. So
you got the parent and the familial engagement so that there's greater carryover at home. What's the Contigo stand for again?
So it's CONTIGO, and it stands for connection. That's the CON part. The T is transformation. IGO is in the great outdoors.
Got it.
Connection and transformation in the great outdoors. And the transformation piece refers to kind of what I talked about, bringing the practice and research together to bring about transformation. And then in the great outdoors refers to the idea of using a setting that is kind of how I described at the very beginning, kind of an away setting where the kids can really be free and have freedom to play without kind of having the built environment around them that we generally have in our daily lives nowadays.
No, I love it. I absolutely love it. Cool. That's really cool. Now, as you transition from a practice, let's say they want to do a little bit of a mix of both. You know, we have to do an eval. We have to set short-term, long-term goals. We have to write a plan of care, get it signed. Are you doing all the same things?
Yeah, I'm really big on this. This is something that's in the Contigo approach course, is that if you are calling something therapy, you should be doing assessment, you should be writing goals, you should be reporting progress, you should be documenting all of those things. I have a real issue when people call things like a nature play class a therapeutic experience or something like that, because I just feel like that's misleading to families. Like if we're going to call something like, yes, nature is therapeutic, but to call something a therapeutic program when it's not therapy and there's not goals being, individual assessment and goals and progress reporting, it makes me nervous. I
Yeah.
just feel like
Yeah.
we need to be professionals. We need to be doing
Yeah.
skilled work, and
Yeah.
assessment and documentation and treatment planning is part of that for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And that's been my criticism of chiropractic. I think there's a lot of chiropractors that are really nice people, but I've never seen a chiropractor write short-term, long-term goals and achieve them and say, you know what, we've achieved all our goals. We've met our plan of care. You're discharged today. I don't
Yeah.
see that. And that's my criticism of that industry, that profession, not the
Mm.
people, but the profession. I think the profession would do it self-service if it was more of a objective therapeutic. So I like the fact that
Yeah.
that's not been lost in going outside. And I do think it is what we said before: better for the patient, more engagement, more motivation, more challenging, better for the clinician, and that you're actually working on functionality. You're
Mhm.
actually working in an actual replicatable functional setting that mom and dad and grandma and grandpa can do with the child over and over again because they're immersed in it, right? And it's where they are.
Totally.
And I love the idea that you don't have to, it doesn't have to be like something you construct. It could be this park, it could be this trail, it could be whatever you want it to be outside. So,
Mhm.
we have a lot of listeners all over the country. So some people are like, well, I'm in Montana and it's going to
Right.
be like 30 below. Not that I think it would be 30 below, but I think there are, well, maybe it does get to 30 below in Montana,
It probably
but
does.
there
Yeah.
are places where, yeah, it actually might, where, I think you said earlier to me once in our conversation, it's not about the weather, it's about how you dress,
Yeah.
right? And if you dress accordingly, dress appropriately, and you find the right space in the outdoors, you don't want to be outside on the ice slope. You might want to
Sure.
be like between the garage and the house, or between
Right.
these two, tree, the tree
Yeah.
line and and so it's breaking some of the headwind. I mean, you can do that, right? You
Yeah.
can navigate that, and it's just as therapeutic, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. There's definitely this was like the core theme or construct that came out of my research was this idea that nature-based therapy is all about braving real life challenges. And
Mhm.
so part of that, a piece of that is that therapists who do this work tend to be more willing to go outdoors and be outdoors in all kinds of weather, right? That's just a part
Mhm.
of nature that
Yeah,
is there. And in some ways we could say we've gotten kind of weak as humans, honestly,
for
in
sure.
we think we're only comfortable if it's 70 degrees. I mean, I joke about my California friends because I lived there for 14 years, and
Right.
I now live in Madison, Wisconsin, and I manage the practice remotely. And we're getting started a second branch of the business here in Madison in the fall. But we're still going in California. And I laugh because people will be like, oh, well, he didn't come today because it was too cold. And it was like 55 degrees, you know?
Right.
So
Right.
I think in some
Right.
ways it's good for us as therapists to be encouraging parents and encouraging children and families to get outdoors in a wider variety of weather, because a lot of times when we look outside and we think it's cold or we don't want to go outside, really what would be really beneficial for us is to put on the clothing and get outside in it. I
That's
actually
right.
just made a reel about this yesterday on Instagram
You're
because
so right about that. And it's
it's
not just
important.
for us physically, it's also for our immune system, and it's also for
Yes.
all of our endocrine system. I mean, it's just so important that we actually push ourselves outside our comfort zone from time to time. We get such immense gains from that. So I couldn't agree with you more. So let's talk about business logistics. I think we've covered the
Okay.
environment, the setting, and how it actually operates. I love the fact that we're still being very therapeutic. So how do I set this up as a business? I'm at home. I'm thinking about doing mobile PT or something similar. And I'm like, whoa, this seems right up my alley. Why don't I do this nature-based program? How do I do that? How do I do that with you and whatnot? Like, yeah, business logistics. I mean, you know how to set them up. Let's just
Yeah.
talk through maybe just a rough draft.
Yeah, I think, well, I actually have a free resource for people. This
Perfect.
is totally a free thing. It's called the 4 step. I don't even remember what I called it, honestly. It's like the nature-based practice roadmap, the 4 steps to like getting your nature-based practice started.
I do
But
that all the
it
time.
might be there's a lot of business logistics stuff in that free
Mhm.
download, because it is like I always say, like, any nature-based program, any development of any program, you have to have some business knowledge, right? You have to
Yeah.
think like a business owner. Even if you're working in schools and you're going to run a few weeks of summer camp, you still have to think like a business owner and go through those steps. So very first thing I would say people should do is look at what's out there in their own area, right? You don't want to replicate exactly what someone else is doing. If you're doing therapy outdoors, that is what is going to set you apart from other local businesses. I actually just went through this myself because it's been really interesting for me actually getting started here in Madison. It's like I'm brand new to business all over again because I'm coming up against the same mindset issues of, oh, are people actually going to pay for this? Like, I don't know, maybe we should price it lower. Maybe we should just do an enrichment camp instead of a therapy camp because it would be cheaper. And I think some of that is legit coming from a place of like, this is a more blue collar area than where I used to live. And so I am thinking like a business owner and like wanting to be able to meet the needs of the people in my community, right? But it's just been interesting for me to have those mindset issues come up because you'd think I'd be kind of over them after running a successful business for 8 years. So the market research is important. And what people have told me here, which is interesting, is to keep it therapy. They're like, no, that's what'll set you apart. I'm like, thank you for telling me what I should already know. Okay. What I would have
Yeah,
told someone
right.
in my
Exactly.
coaching program. Right.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well,
doing the
what's
market
really
research,
good about
yeah,
like listening to you and putting our two pieces together is that we have a 27-step process on how to actually start up a clinic and be successful.
yeah,
We've had one clinic that did not make it to their 3-year anniversary. We've been saying for years and years and years, we've never had a clinic fail. It's never, ever happened. But since 2006 to now, we actually had one clinic not make it to their 3-year anniversary. So I guess we have one clinic failure. So that's not so bad, but and there's reasons why that one didn't happen. It wasn't necessarily on the logistics of business, but
right.
if somebody has that roadmap of how to actually open up get their EIN, get their tax ID number, get their credentialing, their insurance, like we handle a lot of that. I'm sure you help coach on that too, but you will help like integrate that into this setting and this environment and
Yeah.
actually help them on the structure and systems of operation that actually work there.
Yep.
So I would encourage a lot of you guys to look at both of what we have at MAG, check out our website, check out the free resource tab.
Yep.
By all means, at least look at the Startup Accelerator program. If nothing else, the Platinum package will give you everything you need to actually grow a thriving practice. But then look at Laura's stuff, and her website and links will be here in this podcast, and learn on how you can connect with her so she can help you logistically move
Yeah.
from employee to employer. And I'm so glad you said mindset. I am so tired of people trying to go into private practice who are thinking like, well, I'm an OT who happens to be in private practice, instead of being, oh, I'm a business owner who happens to be an OT.
Right.
You need to
Right.
go into it being like, no, I'm a business owner. I'm thinking like a business person, a
Yeah.
CEO, an executive, a director, a manager who happens to have OT after their name,
Yeah.
or who happens
Yeah.
to have PT at the end of their name. It's the wrong mindset to go into it any other way. You actually have to make it thrive, and that means more income than expenses.
Yeah.
And so anyways, it's great that we've put together these strategic schoolings of how to help people
Yeah.
keep that in balance. What would you say, just off the top of your head, just so we can give some advice? What would you say if I was going to do this from scratch? I'm going to leave my job and I'm going to go into private practice doing a nature-based practice. How much capital do I need to pull this off for my first year? What do you advise people to muster up dollars?
I mean,
Do you have a number?
you don't need much. You don't need much. I really feel like the key thing to do is to start bringing revenue in. And I should be very clear too. I don't do like start your business kind of stuff in my program. So I don't do like get your EIN and do the stuff that you guys
Oh,
do.
that's
I
what I
don't do
do.
that in my programs. Right.
Okay,
So I want to
good.
be really clear. Like that's not like what I'm not offering a like walk you through all the steps to start your business. It's more, my programs are more like learn how to do nature-based therapy and then learn the logistics of
Gotcha.
running the practice. Right.
Gotcha.
So
Okay. Well, this makes our
it
compliment even better.
totally. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's what I'm
Yeah.
saying. I want to give props to you because like people should totally look at your stuff to do all that startup nitty gritty business stuff. So, what was the question? I lost it now. I forget
So
what
the
you just asked
dollars
me.
to do it,
Yeah.
because
Dollars to
if
do it.
somebody if somebody comes to me and says, Brian, I want to open up a bricks and mortar 1,500 square foot office, what do I need? I'm like, you need 35 to 100 grand. So between
Totally.
35 of basically a Tesla. So you
Yeah.
need 35 to 100 grand to pop that open. But if you're going to do nature-based outdoors,
No,
I needed to know a number because it can't be that. It can't
no,
possibly
it's
be
not.
that.
I mean, your basic from scratch, I would think a
Yeah.
couple grand, maybe like a website,
That's great.
maybe some paid advertising, maybe printing some
Yeah.
materials,
Right.
paying for the basic things like your business license and all of those things.
Sure.
Really the biggest expense for the space that I have is a $400 a year permit. So $400
Wow.
per year is what I pay for quote unquote rent.
That's crazy.
And even, you know, I'm going to be working with a private landowner, but even that, you're only using the land for like a few hours after school once a week. You're not renting the space 24/7, right? So when you do that, it's still going to be affordable. It's much more affordable than running a brick and mortar practice. Now, I will say, in my experience and in the experience of some nature-based therapists that I have coached in their businesses, there does seem to be a lower productivity rate, right? Because you're not in one place. It's kind of harder to work outdoors. It's tiring, right? So it does seem like the kind of productivity that you might expect in a pediatric clinic setting might not be the same in an outdoor setting, because there's a little bit more logistical stuff, and just the physical nature of the work, I think, is a little more challenging than it might be in an indoor setting. So that's something to consider, right? So I don't know if they usually, I don't know if they like level out. I do think it's still probably more affordable to do nature-based work, just because the cost of rent is one of the major expenses for a private practice.
Rent, utilities, the condo fee, the CAM, the escalator that goes into it. Yeah, all of that for sure. Let me ask, if you're, so the startup cost isn't a barrier to entry. $5,000 or less, you're off to a really good start. Do you find it more viable to do group and build the insurance company's group, or do you find it more viable to build the insurance company's individual care, or is it cash? I mean, those are the three buckets you're doing.
Yeah. So I'm a cash-based practice. We are in California, and we will be in Madison as well. I'm actually starting a nonprofit because I really want to, it's been on my list for many years to do this. So as soon as the PhD was done, I filed that paperwork. I was like, this is the thing I've wanted to do for so long. So I'm starting a nonprofit to raise funds for scholarships for kids to attend nature-based therapy, because in my experience, most of the practices are cash pay practices, because we want to be able to do things how we want to do them. A lot of times just getting into an outdoor space can take longer. And so an hour-long session just doesn't do it justice. You want to be there 90 minutes or 2 hours. For summer camps, you might want to do 4 to 6 hour days. And so, so we're cash pay, but I do know of several nature-based practices that bill Medicaid or bill private insurance. And the way that they do that is, yes, they bill the same way you would bill for individual services. You're just in a different setting than you might be, right? You're still doing skilled therapy. You are still a skilled PT or a skilled OT or a skilled SLP doing skilled therapy with that child, just in a nature setting versus inside of a clinic or a school or whatever. So you'd bill the same way you would normally bill with ethical treatment codes or billing codes and all of that. The way that I have heard some people bill for the groups, if you are billing insurance or Medicaid, for example, you could have 4 children in a group. You run the group for 2 hours, and each child gets half an hour essentially of that 2 hour segment, right? Gotcha. So you're billing individually for each kid for a half hour, but they're attending a 2 hour long group. The group code is total junk with reimbursement. I've seen rates as low as $8 for a group code because it's untimed, right? And so at least for OT it is. So it's just ludicrous, and our insurance system is broken, and we could go on a huge tangent.
We could have a whole podcast on that. Believe me, don't get me started. That is insane. Insurance wise, is for liability for you and as providers, not a big problem. Just have professional liability insurance.
It's a good question. I actually have a video on this inside my community because it's a question a lot of people ask. And I have, knock on wood, never had my liability insurance randomly canceled, but I have known of a few people who have said that they canceled because of, quote, high risk or something. Like they saw their website or something and saw that they were outside and they considered it high risk, right? But I do know I've used Hiscox for my insurance for many years, and they've been great. I've always been able to very easily. A lot of times when you use a site, that's something people should look at too, is like look at local sites in your area that are nature spaces and make sure that you're allowed to use them for business purposes. Like sometimes there'll be laws against using public spaces for business. There might be special permits that you need. So those are things to look into. But I know that I've never had a problem with my liability insurance adding the park as an additional insured, and it doesn't cost any extra. It's just a kind of a tagline that you put on that policy.
That's what I was going to say. Just add it as an additional insured, that site, that park, that venue.
Yep.
Yep. That makes sense. That makes total sense. Well, good. I wanted to make sure that wasn't going to be a barrier to entry. This is exciting. This is so much fun. I mean, we know the whole COVID thing ruined our kids by separating them and keeping them indoors. And if there's ever been a better time to actually get them immersed outside and back and touching the dirt and the grass and the leaves and the soil and the bark and the trees and the creeks and the streams. I mean, I'm looking out my window right now and I just love seeing the streams and the green and the creek and the pasture.
Yeah.
It's just, to me, it's just like, that's what life is all about, right? That's where we should be. And we're better to actually help people make, physiological gains than in the environment in which they live. So Laura, you're doing a great thing. This is groundbreaking stuff, everybody. I hope you really learned something from Laura here and gained some insight. And I hope you have a million questions so you can reach out to her and have her answer them to you specifically. This is in my opinion, depending on where you are, this requires a unique conversation. California is not Rhode Island, and Rhode Island's not Montana, and Montana's not Florida.
Right.
So I do think if you're conjuring up these things, don't let them be a barrier to entry for you. Get your questions answered, reach in through this podcast, get to Laura, learn how you can do it. I even think a complement of both an office and outdoors is not outside the mix. I don't think there's a problem with a 1,100 square foot, 1,200 square foot office. And, maybe once or twice a week you're in the office, and then 3 days a week you're out on the nature trail.
Yeah.
If I was doing it, I mean, I don't want to taint the well here, but if it were me, I mean, I don't think I could break myself from still having some office time. So, and even as a provider, I think, I know what my body can do, and working with kids, I think I would like that balance. But man, the fact that you've been there, done that, and you have it, what a wealth of knowledge you are. So that's it for me. Laura, I'm going to leave you with the last word. What would you like to share? And what would you like to let everybody know?
I would just love people to try going outdoors with kids, or with adults for that matter. I mean, I just try to take a session outdoors and see what happens. Just be expectant and be looking and noticing, and just see what happens, see how it feels. You might never want to go back, but and then I would also just say, if people are interested in this, I am so happy and grateful to have been invited to talk on your podcast with you about this topic, Brian, because my goal this year was like, I need to get outside of OTs. Like, I want PTs to know about this and speech therapists to know about this. So if there are any PTs out there doing nature-based practice, please get in touch with me, because I want you to come on my podcast for Therapy in the Great Outdoors to talk about nature-based PT. And if there are people out there interested in nature-based practice, they can go to therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com. They can join the free membership community there. There's tons of free resources on there for people to kind of get started in this work. So that's what I would say to come hang out and ask questions.
Oh, that's perfect. That's great. And, everybody should listen to your podcast who's interested in this. And I always tell people, I don't care what the initials are after your name, as long as you're in the mindset of trying to give more in value than you ever expect in return. I feel like our success has been, how can we exchange more in value than we ever expect in return, and find a way to do that in a very happy work-life balance for the owner as well as the employees. Everybody's entitled to work-life balance. 1/3 of your life sleep, 1/3 of your life work, 1/3 of your life friends, family, recreation. You got to balance those 3 buckets of time out. That's the only buckets of time you spend. So Laura, you're a breath of fresh air. You're very energetic. You have a very, very successful model here. I just can't say enough great things about it. I think more and more of us deserve to be working outside. So many of us are working from home. I think that's getting a little old. I think we should actually be outside. And I think a lot of my listeners are going to really reach in and want to learn more about that. So Rachel will have all the contact information on this podcast. You guys could always reach into Meg. We're going to have cross links, www.megbusiness.com. Other than that, thank you so much, everybody, for listening. I know there's a lot of things you can do, YouTube and Rumble or wherever you go for your information, but you choose to be here. And I'm very grateful for that. So start each and every day thinking of 5 things you're grateful for, and never start the day without expecting to do well. I appreciate y'all. See you next week.